One Russian Su-35, 3.5 generations ahead of anything Ukraine had flown until recently. Thrust vectoring engines, a radar that can see for hundreds of kilometers, missiles that can kill from beyond visual range. And on July 8, 2026, it went down over eastern Ukraine, shot out of the sky by an aircraft the Kremlin has spent years publicly mocking as obsolete, the Ukrainian F-16. This is the first confirmed air-to-air kill of a Russian fighter jet by a Ukrainian F-16 since these aircraft arrived on the battlefield, confirmed not by Kiev's propaganda machine, but by the top-ranking general in the entire United States military, standing in front of Congress. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, what it means for the air, war over Ukraine, and the one detail buried in the Russian side of this story that tells you more about Moscow's military culture than almost anything else that's come out of this war. Before we go further, I flew F-15E Strike Eagles in combat, and before that, I flew with the Thunderbirds. Air-to-air engagements are the part of this job that gets the most Hollywood treatment and the least honest explanation, so I want to walk you through this one the way I'd actually brief it. Here's my promise to you. I'll tell you what's confirmed, what's still developing, and where there's genuine debate. And on this story, there's real debate, because the Russian and Ukrainian sides don't even agree on what shot the plane down. Let's start with the aircraft involved, because you can't understand why this kill matters without understanding the mismatch it's supposed to represent. The Su-35, known by NATO as the Flanker E, is Russia's most advanced operational multi-role fighter still in frontline mass service, a 4.5 generation aircraft, meaning it sits just short of true 5th generation stealth fighters like the F-22 or F-35, but carries nearly everything else those jets have. Thrust vectoring engines that let it maneuver in ways most Western fighters physically can't match, a powerful Urbis-E passive electronically scanned array radar with an enormous detection range against large targets, long-range air-to-air missiles capable of engaging opponents before those opponents even know the Su-35 is there. It has, for years, been the backbone of Russia's aerospace forces, the aircraft Moscow trusted with its most demanding air superiority missions. Now compare that to Ukraine's F-16. The F-16 Fighting Falcon is a legendary aircraft, no question. It's one of the most produced and most combat-tested fighter jets in modern history, flown by dozens of air forces worldwide since it entered service in the late 1970s. But the airframes Ukraine received are not new-build aircraft fresh off a production line. According to Newsweek's reporting on this story, Ukraine has been flying F-16s for roughly 2 years. And according to Militarny's coverage, the jets are being transferred to Ukraine after refurbishment and modernization from the air forces of Norway, Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands. European nations retiring their own older F-16 fleets as they transition to newer aircraft like the F-35. Ukraine is expected to receive around 100 of these jets total. So, on paper, this is a genuinely lopsided matchup. A modernized but fundamentally older generation airframe going up against one of Russia's most capable active fighters. That mismatch is exactly why this particular shootdown got flagged as historic rather than routine. Quick ask before we go further. If you want to keep tracking the air war over Ukraine as it develops, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This is a story with new details still emerging on both the Ukrainian and Russian sides, and I'll be covering it as the picture gets clearer. So let's walk through what's actually confirmed happened. According to Militarny's reporting, the Russian aircraft is believed to have been shot down on July 8, 2026. Right after the incident, a Russian pro-war telegram channel called Voyevoda Veshchait, run by a military commentator named Alexei Zemtsov, acknowledged the loss publicly and identified the downed aircraft as a Su-35, adding that the pilot survived and was rescued. That's worth pausing on for a second. This wasn't a Ukrainian claim first. It was effectively confirmed, at least in terms of the loss itself, by pro-Russian military bloggers close to Moscow's own defense establishment, before it became a major Western news story. Then, on Tuesday, roughly 2 weeks later, the story went from a battlefield rumor to an officially confirmed U.S. government statement. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified before the Senate Appropriations Committee, and according to multiple outlets, including Defense News, the Eurasian Times, and the Aviationist, he told lawmakers directly that Ukraine had recently achieved its first air-to-air kill, where a Ukrainian F-16 shot down a Russian fighter. His exact framing, as widely reported, was that this reflected the incredible work Ukraine's own industrial base and defense forces have done in scaling up their capabilities, from surface to air systems all the way through to air-to-air combat. That's about as authoritative a confirmation as you can get on a battlefield claim. Not a press release from Kiev, but sworn testimony from the top uniformed officer in the entire U.S. military, in front of Congress, on the record. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely interesting. And where the confirmed facts run out and the competing claims begin, General Kane notably did not name the specific type of Russian aircraft involved in his testimony, and he didn't disclose the location, date, or detailed circumstances of the engagement. Ukrainian media outlets connected the dots themselves, pointing back to a Ukrainian Air Force statement from July 8th claiming to have shot down an Su-35 over eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian Air Force's own public statement, as widely quoted across multiple outlets, leaned more on national pride than tactical detail, essentially celebrating that Ukraine's forces had, in their words, subtracted another Russian aircraft from the fight, and specifically noting that the pilot who had been shot down had been an experienced adversary who'd been causing serious problems for Ukrainian forces in that sector of the front. But here's the genuine point of dispute, and it's a meaningful one. According to multiple sources, including the Eurasian Times, Newsweek, and The Aviationist, unverified reports circulating alongside the initial announcement suggested a Ukrainian F-16 may have been responsible for the shootdown, but at the time, neither the Ukrainian Air Force nor Russian officials had confirmed that specific detail. In fact, Russian pro-war telegram channels pushed back on the F-16 explanation almost immediately. According to Newsweek's reporting, a popular Russian telegram channel with purported links to Moscow's own Air Force claimed that 3 Ukrainian aircraft and a Patriot air defense system had all been involved in targeting the Su-35, rather than crediting a single F-16 with a clean air-to-air kill. Militarny's reporting adds an important detail here too. Some Russian pro-war channels specifically claimed the aircraft had actually been downed by a Ukrainian Patriot air defense system after becoming engaged in an aerial battle with Ukrainian aircraft rather than being shot down purely by another jet. Critically, no evidence has been provided to support that alternative claim, according to Militarny's coverage. So you have competing narratives, the American general's testimony and most Western reporting crediting a clean F-16 air-to-air kill, and Russian-aligned sources pushing an alternative story involving ground-based air defense, without offering proof for that version. There's one more piece of this that deserves attention, because it comes from an unusual source. The Aviationist reporting cites a Russian military commentary account known as Fighter Bomber, which the outlet describes as having ties to many frontline Russian aerospace forces units and a history of distributing crowd-funded supplies to Russian troops. Despite being a hardline, pro-government aligned account, Fighter Bomber has periodically reported real Russian losses throughout this war and has even criticized Russian Ministry of Defense planning and procurement decisions in the past. According to that account's own commentary on this incident, translated and reported by the Aviationist, the Russian side acknowledged acting in a predictable manner while the Ukrainian side did not, and separately noted that the Russian fighter had been hesitant to engage 2 F-16s on its own. That's a remarkably candid admission from a source generally sympathetic to the Russian military, and it lines up with the broader Western narrative. A numerically or tactically hesitant single Russian jet facing at least 2 Ukrainian F-16s in an engagement Russia apparently didn't handle as well as its aircraft specifications alone might suggest it should have. Now let's zoom out into the technical and doctrinal analysis, because that's where the real insight is. Why would a supposedly superior aircraft like the Su-35 lose an engagement to an older F-16, even a modernized one? The honest answer, and every serious aviation analyst will tell you this, is that raw airframe specifications are only part of the equation in real air combat. As the Eurasian Times reported, aviation analysts have repeatedly noted that real-world air combat outcomes depend far more on pilot training, tactics, situational awareness, and the broader sensor and command network supporting an aircraft than on paper specifications alone. This is actually one of the most important and consistent lessons in the entire history of air combat, going back to Vietnam and even earlier. A technologically superior aircraft flown by a less experienced or less well-supported pilot, operating without good sensor fusion or reliable early warning support, can absolutely lose to an older aircraft that's better integrated into a networked system of radars, data links, and coordinated tactics. And that's exactly the pattern Ukraine has reportedly been building. This engagement didn't happen in isolation. It built on a similar, earlier shootdown. According to Defense Blog's reporting, Ukraine's Air Force reported a broadly similar incident back in June of 2025, when it announced the destruction of a Su-35S over Russia's Kursk region, a claim later reinforced by drone footage showing the wrecked aircraft on the ground near a village called Urisovo. German newspaper Bild reported at the time, citing Ukrainian sources, that the June 2025 shootdown involved a Ukrainian F-16 firing an AIM-120 AMRAAM missile, a long-range radar-guided air-to-air missile, using targeting data supplied by a Swedish-built Saab 340 airborne early warning aircraft operating hundreds of kilometers away from the actual engagement. Bild characterized that operation as a historic first for Ukraine's F-16 fleet at the time. What that tells you is that Ukraine's Air Force isn't just flying F-16s in isolation and hoping for the best in a dogfight. It's building an integrated system combining airborne early warning, long-range missiles, and coordinated multi-aircraft tactics that lets an objectively less capable airframe compete with, and in this case defeat, one of Russia's best fighters. There's also a broader supply and demand dimension to this story that's worth understanding, and it connects to something happening far from the actual battlefield. According to the Kyiv Post's reporting, around the same time as this most recent shootdown, Russia reportedly completed production of the first batch of 20 Su-35 fighters ordered by Iran, marking a major step in Tehran's effort to modernize its own aging air force, the same Iranian air force we discussed in an earlier breakdown, the one built around missile and drone doctrine specifically because it lacked modern fighter aircraft. According to Military Watch magazine, cited in that same Kyiv Post reporting, these aircraft were built at Russia's Komsomolsk-on-Amur aviation plant, with Iran's own defense ministry covering maintenance and sustainment costs, while the jets remain in Russia ahead of eventual transfer. The report adds that this follows leaked Russian military-industrial correspondence from late 2025, indicating that 16 Su-35s were already in production for Iran at that point. Why does this matter here? Because it means Russia's Su-35 production line is simultaneously trying to replace its own combat losses over Ukraine, like the one we just covered, while also fulfilling export orders to Iran, a country that just fought a major war against the US and Israel earlier this year. That's a real strain on a single industrial pipeline, serving two active or recent wartime customers at once. And it's a detail that connects these two conflicts in a way most coverage treats as entirely separate stories. Now here's the strategic layer, and this is genuinely the sharpest insight in this whole breakdown. The shootdown isn't really about one aircraft, one pilot, or even one engagement. It's a signal about where the broader air war over Ukraine is heading. For most of this war, Russia's Air Force has operated with a significant technological and numerical advantage, but has been remarkably cautious about actually contesting Ukrainian airspace directly, largely because Ukraine's ground-based air defenses, things like Patriot batteries and NASAM systems, made deep incursions costly. What we're now seeing with confirmed F-16 kills against advanced Russian fighters is the emergence of a second layer of that deterrent. Not just ground-based missiles keeping Russian jets at a distance, but Ukrainian aircraft themselves now credibly threatening Russia's best airframes in direct aerial engagements. If that pattern holds and scales, it changes Russia's calculus meaningfully. A Su-35 pilot who might have once felt reasonably safe pushing closer to the front line now has to weigh the real possibility of encountering a networked, early warning supported Ukrainian F-16 patrol that can engage from beyond visual range. That's the kind of psychological and doctrinal shift that doesn't show up in a single day's headline, but compounds over months, shaping where each side is willing to fly, how aggressively, and how deep into contested airspace. There's also a coalition and industrial dimension worth flagging, tying back to General Kane's own framing of this event. He specifically tied this kill to a broader point about a 3-year halt in U.S. air defense funding and Ukraine's own industrial base scaling its capabilities. That's a politically significant framing, because it positions this shootdown not just as a battlefield event, but as evidence in an ongoing debate inside Washington about how much continued investment in Ukraine's air capabilities is actually paying off. Every time an aircraft like this goes down, it becomes a data point in that funding argument, proof to supporters of continued aid that the investment in F-16 transfers and integrated air defense networks is translating into real combat results against Russia's best equipment, not just symbolic support. Now let's talk about the human and economic stakes underneath all the hardware and doctrine, because there's a real person at the center of this story too. According to the initial pro-Russian Telegram reporting, the pilot of the downed Su-35 survived and was rescued. That's worth acknowledging directly. Bruce, this wasn't a story with a fatal outcome for the aircrew involved, whatever the disputed circumstances of the shootdown itself. But zoom out further, and this single engagement sits inside a brutal war of attrition in the skies that's been running for years now. Ukraine's own reporting, cited by the Kyiv Post, notes that this loss adds to what Kyiv describes as mounting Russian aviation losses, with Moscow having lost, by Ukraine's count, over 400 aircraft and more than 350 helicopters across the full span of the war. Those are Ukrainian government figures, worth treating with appropriate caution given they come from one side of an active conflict. But even accounting for that, they point to an air war that has been extraordinarily costly for Russia's Air Force over time, regardless of exactly how any single aircraft, including this one, actually went down. And economically, every one of these advanced fighters represents an enormous sunk cost for Russia's defense industry. Aircraft that take years to build, pilots who take years to train to a competent operational standard, all being consumed in a war that shows no sign of ending cleanly. Meanwhile, on the other side, every successful F-16 engagement represents a return on a genuinely massive multinational investment. European nations retiring and transferring their own fighter fleets, American munitions like the AIM-120 AMRAAM being supplied in numbers, and years of pilot training programs conducted specifically to get Ukrainian aviators combat ready on Western hardware. Both sides are burning through enormously expensive, hard-to-replace assets in a war that increasingly looks like it will be decided as much by which side can sustain its industrial and training pipeline, longer as by any single dramatic engagement. So here's what I want to know from you. First, if Russian pro-war sources are right that a Patriot system was actually involved in this shootdown, rather than a clean F-16 air-to-air kill, does that change how you view Ukraine's air combat progress? Or does the outcome, a downed Su-35 either way, matter more than which specific system gets the credit? Second, with Russia's Su-35 production line reportedly serving both its own wartime losses over Ukraine and export orders to Iran simultaneously, do you think that industrial strain will start visibly affecting how quickly Russia can replace aircraft like this one going forward? And third, does a confirmed pattern of F-16 kills against Russia's best fighters actually shift Russian air doctrine toward more caution near the front line? Or is Russia's Air Force too large and too committed to this war for a handful of losses to meaningfully change its operational posture? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if this kind of detailed, sourced breakdown helps you actually understand the air war, rather than just the headlines, share it. There's a lot of noise around stories like this, and not nearly enough careful sourcing. Let's recap what's actually confirmed here. A Russian Su-35 fighter jet was shot down over eastern Ukraine, believed to have occurred on July 8, 2026, according to Militarny's reporting. Pro-Russian military bloggers acknowledged the loss shortly after it happened and said the pilot survived. General Dan Kane, chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, confirmed in Senate testimony that a Ukrainian F-16 had achieved its first air-to-air kill against a Russian fighter without naming the specific aircraft type. Ukrainian media and most Western outlets tied that confirmation to the July 8th Su-35 loss. Russian pro-war channels disputed the F-16 explanation, alternatively claiming a Patriot air defense system was involved, though no evidence has been provided for that version. And this engagement builds on a documented pattern going back to a similar F-16 kill of a Su-35S over Russia's own Kursk region back in June of 2025, using long-range missiles and airborne early warning support. This remains a contested story in its specific details, but the broader trend it points to, a genuinely credible Ukrainian air-to-air threat to Russia's best fighters, is becoming harder to dismiss with each new incident. Stay with me. I'll keep tracking this one as more details and likely more disputes come out.